Today I want to talk about the Uvalde disaster that happened May 24th, where almost 400 law enforcement agents showed up to the school where an active school shooter was present. And those officers waited over an hour while kids were being massacred before finally breaking in and stopping him. How could that possibly happen? And I want to explain this in terms of human evolution, at least in part. So the first thing was that the initial officers who arrived on the scene obviously backed off out of fear. They didn't want to die. They wanted backup. That's understandable but unfortunate. A certain percentage of human beings will disregard those feelings and will continue to charge forward. And if one of them had been present, those kids might have been saved. Now that person might also have died in the process, but many kids would have been saved. The trouble is there's very few of those people amongst humanity in general, and there's a reason for that. It's called group selection. Darwin talked about it, and others have talked about it since. So usually you think of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, that individuals compete against each other, and the strongest individual or the brightest or the best adapted to that particular environment will survive, whereas the weaker individual will not. And that stronger individual will pass their genes on to the gene pool. And so that species will continue to develop and evolve in a way that favors them or allows them to survive over time. That's fine to a limited degree, but humans don't do well as individuals. In fact, as predators, we're among the most vulnerable on the planet. Imagine trying to survive as an individual against lions or wolves or bears. We don't stand a chance. It's extremely hard. The only way we've survived and prospered is to survive as a group. Now, in order to survive as a group, we have to cooperate. And cooperation tends to go in the opposite direction of how we usually think of evolution and of evolutionary pressure, which is by and large competitive. But the key is that if you can have cooperation within the group among the individuals, that group then can compete more strongly against other groups and come out ahead. And that's what's happened with humanity. We've been able to work together in groups, to put aside our differences, to not fight so much amongst ourselves for the better good. And then we've been able to create cities. We've been able to slay beasts that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. We've been able to defeat other human groups that were less well adapted. So it's been extremely important. But what exactly does that mean when it comes to human beings individually? It means that we select for a tamer breed of human, more like dogs and less like wolves, I suppose. We are tamer in the sense that we don't fight amongst each other as much. You can imagine a group of alpha males all trying to get along. Well, they don't get along so well. They're constantly jockeying for position, fighting one another. And if everyone was an alpha female or male, we would be tearing our societies apart. But because the majority of people tend to be followers by nature, they tend to follow the rules. They tend to want to fit in with the group. They tend to wait for orders from the person that's in charge. We've been able to survive through time and able to triumph. Unfortunately, that exact same adaptation that has helped us in the past is what hurt us at Uvalde. Because after the first few people came and did nothing, then we started to have large numbers of officers appear. And at that point, we get the principle of diffusion of responsibility. This principle came up most notably in 1964 when Kitty Genovese, a native of New York City, was raped and murdered, stabbed to death in broad daylight. At the time, it was reported that there were 38 eyewitnesses, or witnesses at least to hearing her scream, who did nothing. And her death took hours because the killer originally ran away and then he came back to finish her off. And it seemed like it just didn't make any sense. Now, later on, people have questioned that number of witnesses, but the basic principle has survived, That is that when there's a large group of people, people tend to look to everyone else for orders, for taking charge, for taking care of the problem at hand. That is, they figure someone else is going to act. Someone else is going to save that person. I don't need to get involved. I don't need to risk myself. So the larger the group, the greater division of responsibility, the less likely someone is going to act to save that individual, or in this case, the kids that were trapped inside that school building. So society has always needed a few impulsive individuals, people who are not natural rule followers, who tend to flout the rules, in fact. And if they're successful, they learn to balance their natural tendencies towards independence and self-motivation and drive. They balance that with enough rule following that they can get along in society, although they may frequently have problem times or problem eras. This is often depicted in our stories and myths. Most recently, Tom Cruise in Top Gun 2 was on the edge of being kicked out of the military over and over again, only saved by his buddy. But in the end, he's the guy that they need to save the world, essentially. And that's a common story from ancient times till now, that the hero arises from the depths, or arises from the problem group, the problem class, to end up saving everybody else. And that's been true in real life, too. In the ancient times, there were war chiefs and peace chiefs. And the war chiefs might be very vicious and might be a very different kind of person than the peace chief, who had to cooperate with everybody and develop cooperation in the group. Whereas the war chief would lead and would demand and would charge into battle and send people into battle. That happened during World War II and other times when Winston Churchill was brought forward in England during times of peace and put to the side, or rather brought forward in England during times of war and put to the side during times of peace. So there are instances when we have to have the independent-minded individual. Stanley Milgram in the 1960s did an interesting experiment which demonstrated that 65% of people will follow orders all the way up to the point of thinking they're killing somebody else by electrocuting them. But 35% of people don't. Now, if we had more of those 35% amongst the officers that were at Uvalde, maybe some of them, maybe lower down the ranks, would have charged forward and said, "The heck with the rules, I'm getting in there and I'm stopping that guy." But we didn't have enough of them. And that's partly because as we've gotten larger and larger as societies, we've had to emphasize more and more the rule following and the cooperation, and put more and more of a damper on independence and competitiveness, etc., and winning. And that is a problem, as was demonstrated at Uvalde. Where it occurs in our schools right now, where kids who are more active and more independent are reprimanded, or they're even arrested by the police, who now are in school systems. And it remains a problem, and is a growing problem in many areas of society, where achievement and personal strength is now being denigrated as somehow unfair or not right. And the cost will be further Uvaldes, and in different settings and in different ways. But in order to survive as a society, we have to have the proper balance of those who will follow orders and of that tendency within us, and also the other tendency to do what is right at the time, in spite of all the pressures from peers and from authority to do otherwise. And that's not an easy balance to find, but we need to recognize the importance not only of the rule follower, but also of the rule breaker. We need to recognize the importance not only of careful work and sticking to the plan, but also of impulsivity. Both are important for our survival. My name's Jewel Miller, and that's what I have to say today.